If I was to ask you, when you think about Resident Evil, who do you credit? Now, most of us would say Shinji Mikami, confidently. Final answer, Alex. And that's totally fair. But what if I told you survival horror had a grandfather? What if I told you The Mansion didn't start in 1996? What if I told you before the zombie turned its head? Before Jill almost became a sandwich? There was an 8-bit haunted house on a Japanese cartridge that most of us never even touched. Well, today, we're not just celebrating Resident Evil. We're tracing its bloodline from Tokuro Fujiwara to Shinji Mikami, to the genre that changed how we feel fear in video games. Hey, and welcome back to the Average Joe Nerdcast. And this is Checkpoint Thursday. I'm Nate, your resident Average Joe, the guy who still pauses before opening doors in video games because, well, let's be honest, 1996 permanently altered my nervous system. And today, we're doing something a little different. We're not ranking entries in the Resident Evil franchise. We're not debating tank controls. We're not yelling about remakes. We're talking about the creators, about mentorship, about lineage. Because survival horror didn't just appear out of nowhere. It evolved over time. And that evolution tells a much better story than any single jump scare ever could. So buckle up. We're going back to 1989. Now, before I can even say the name Shinji Mikami again, we're going to sit with Tokuro Fujiwara for just a minute. Because this is one of those moments in gaming history where if you don't zoom out, you miss the whole lineage. Fujiwara wasn't some niche experimental dev tucked away in a corner. He was Capcom royalty. This man worked on Ghosts and Goblins. Which, by the way, if you've ever played Ghosts and Goblins, you know that game does not care about your feelings. Like, at all. It's punishing, it's relentless, it's structured around pressure. You don't just mash your way through the levels. You have to learn it. You have to endure it. And then you respect it. And all of that is important. Because before horror became cinematic, before polygons and pre-rendered backgrounds, Fujiwara already understood something incredibly critical. Pressure is engagement. You don't need spectacle to create tension. You need consequence. So let's fast forward to 1989, the Famicom era. And he directs a game called, and if you listen to the first episode, you know what I'm about to say, Sweet Home. Most of us in the West, we never got to play it. It was Japanese only, based loosely on a horror film by the same name. And it was done in a top-down RPG format. And on paper, it doesn't necessarily scream genre-defining, does it? But then you start looking at what it actually did. You control a group of characters exploring a mansion. And now already we're in familiar territory. But here's the twist. Each and every character has limited inventory, different tools, and specific utility. You cannot carry everything. And that right there is huge, because in most games of that era, inventory wasn't stress. It was just storage. Sweet Home makes it stress. Now, here's the part that really makes you blink. If a character dies, they stay dead. There is no checkpoint reload, no continue from last save, no magical undo button. They're just gone. And the ending changes depending on who survives. And this was all in 1989. Meanwhile, over here in North America, we're hopping on turtles and collecting rings. Fujiwara was experimenting with permadeath in a narrative horror framework. That's not just spooky flavor. That's structural tension. That's someone saying, what if loss matters? And when you zoom out, you can start to see it. The mansion layout as a puzzle, backtracking as game design, limited resources, consequences. That right there is the skeleton. Not cinematic yet, not atmospheric yet, but mechanically, survival horror DNA is right there. And this is where I think people underestimate Fujiwara's impact. Sweet Home didn't explode globally. It never became a mainstream horror icon. But it did prove something internally at Capcom. It proved horror could be system-driven, not just aesthetic. And that right there is the big difference. You see, a lot of early horror games leaned on visuals, or shock, or theme. Sweet Home, on the other hand, leaned on systems. And that system-based fear, that's what makes survival horror work later on. Now, imagine being inside Capcom in the early 90s. You've got Fujiwara. You've got this experimental horror RPG in the company's history. You've got evolving hardware. You've got the PlayStation era looming. And there's this idea floating around. What if we revisit horror? Not from scratch, but take something from the past and make it modern. And that's the moment where lineage starts forming. Because Fujiwara isn't just sitting on the Sweet Home idea, he's carrying it forward. He moves into a producer role. He mentors. He influences. And when Capcom wants to modernize horror, he doesn't direct it himself. He hands it off to a younger developer. And that's where this becomes a lineage story instead of a solo legend story. Because Fujiwara planted the Haunted Mansion, he planted the idea that space can create tension, scarcity can create fear, consequence can create investment. He just didn't yet have the cinematic language to amplify it. The technology, it just wasn't there yet. And the presentation wasn't there either. But the thinking was already evolving. And that's why when people say Resident Evil invented survival horror, I always want to gently adjust that. Resident Evil defined it, yes, but Sweet Home experimented with it. Fujiwara didn't make the mansion famous. He made it possible, and that right there matters. Because when the student enters the picture, he doesn't invent the haunted house. He just inherits it. Now enter Shinji Mikami. And here's the part that always makes me smile. He wasn't the horror guy. He didn't show up wearing a trench coat muttering about dread and despair or doom and gloom. Shinji Mikami joined Capcom in the early 90s like a lot of young developers did. Learning, experimenting, figuring it all out as he went. One of his earlier directorial projects? Goof Troop. Yes, that Goof Troop. Bright, colorful, cartoony, co-op, puzzle-driven. And I love that. Because it means the guy who would eventually traumatize every 90s kid with the very first Resident Evil started by designing cooperative puzzles for Goofy and his son Max. But here's why that matters. Goof Troop is built around environmental logic. You can't just brute force your way through the game. You have to solve the rooms. You learn item usage. You coordinate space. That right there, that's structure. That's flow. That's understanding how a player moves through an environment. And if you're paying attention up until this point, you start to see how that training transfers later. Because survival horror isn't just about the monsters. It's all about space. It's about how you move through rooms, how doors connect to each other, how puzzles gate progress, how the environment controls your pace. Mikami learned spatial logic before he ever built Dread. And I think that right there is huge. Because when Capcom revisits horror in the mid-90s, they don't hand it to someone obsessed with blood and gore. They hand it to someone who understands structure, Now, remember, Fujiwara is now in a producer role. He's already experimented with horror mechanics through his game Sweet Home. He understands that the mansion framework works, but the hardware, it's changing. The PlayStation is here. CD-ROMs allow for cinematic ambition. 3D environments are becoming viable. So the question becomes, how can we modernize this idea? You see, originally, the concept for what would become Resident Evil leaned closer to being a modern remake of Sweet Home. That's not speculation. That's development lineage. The mansion setting? Inherited. Puzzle structure? Inherited. Limited inventory space? Inherited. The bones were there, but bones do not define a genre. Interpretation does. And this is where Mikami's personality starts shaping the future. He was not a horror purist. He wasn't trying to recreate a film in game form. He was just trying to create tension through control. And that's a subtle but massive difference. A horror purist might focus on spectacle. Mikami focused on the systems. He asked, how do we make the player uncomfortable? Not through jump scares, but through restriction. And here's where we need to appreciate the risk. The early to mid-90s were not slow game territory. Arcade energy still had influence. Speed was very attractive. The power fantasy was dominant. Slowing the player down, limiting resources, making them vulnerable, that wasn't the safe move. That was the disciplined move. And this is why I always say, Mikami didn't invent survival horror. He just refined it. He took Fujiwara's structural experiment and said, what if we make the player hesitate? And that hesitation becomes everything. And what I respect most about this era of Mikami is that he wasn't trying to make a franchise. He was just trying to make a tense video game. There was no 30-year roadmap, no cinematic universe blueprint. There was just, can we make something that feels different? And that's where the lineage becomes evolution. Fujiwara builds the haunted house skeleton, and Mikami inherits it. But instead of just modernizing it, he slows it way down. And that slowdown is where the genre is born. Not in 1989, not fully formed in 1996 either, but in the decision to embrace vulnerability. And vulnerability is not flashy. It's subtle, controlled, disciplined, which is wild when you think about what Resident Evil eventually becomes. Because this quiet, structured design choice creates a franchise about bioorganic nightmares. But it all starts with a guy who learned puzzle flow on Goof Troop. That's the part I absolutely love. The lineage isn't dramatic. It's developmental. It's growth. And that's why this handoff matters. Because when we move into the actual development of Resident Evil, you'll see exactly where that discipline pays off. So we've got the seed and we've got the student. Now we're in the mid-90s. CD-ROMs are changing the game. 3D environments are becoming viable, and the original PlayStation is carving out a brand new space. And Capcom decides, we're going back to horror. And not arcade horror, not ghost in a level horror. A full game built around horror. A mansion, isolation, tension. So Resident Evil enters development. Now here's something that often gets flattened in retrospectives. Resident Evil was not guaranteed to work. It feels completely inevitable now, but at the time, this was a huge risk, because the gaming climate was not slow. The gaming climate was all about speed. The arcade DNA was still lingering. Quake and Doom energy was loud, and action games sold. Slowing the players down, limiting resources, making them feel weak, that wasn't the obvious move. But this is where Mikami makes the choice that defines survival horror. He doesn't make the player powerful. He makes the player cautious. And that right there, that's everything. So let's talk about the fixed camera angles. Today, we debate them. Some people, they hate them. Some people, they romanticize them. But in 1996, they were completely brilliant. Not just because of hardware limitations, because, yes, pre-rendered backgrounds helped performance, but much more importantly, they controlled the player's perspective. You don't see what's around the corner. You don't control framing. So you don't own the space. The game owns the space. That creates tension without a single monster being present. A hallway, you see, becomes stressful. A staircase becomes suspicious. A door becomes a commitment. And that's the word I love using here. Commitment. When you open a door in Resident Evil, you are committing. You're not sprinting through it. You're not bunny hopping. You're committing to the unknown. That loading screen door animation, it's not just a transition. It's anticipation. It's dread. It's silence stretched thin. That right there is psychological design, and that's Mikami's restraint showing up. So let's talk scarcity as philosophy. Resident Evil does something that feels small but changes the entire blueprint. It makes bullets precious. Not necessarily rare, just precious. You count them. You hesitate before every trigger pull. You decide whether something is worth killing or worth avoiding. That's not action design philosophy. That's all survival design. And then he doubles down. Ink ribbons. Saving your game costs you something. Let that sink in. Saving your progress costs resources. And that was insane. You see, in most games, saving is security. But in Resident Evil, saving is strategy. You have to ask yourself, is this moment worth the use of an ink ribbon? That is tension baked into the system itself. Not a jump scare, not a cutscene, but the system itself. And that's why all of this works, because it's all cohesive. Everything supports vulnerability, from the camera to the controls to the inventory to the ammo to the saving. It all says, you are not in control. And that at the time was completely radical. So now imagine pitching that internally. We're going to slow the players down. We're going to restrict their view. We're going to limit their ammo. We're going to make saving conditional. That's a hard sell in a market chasing speed and spectacle. And this is where Mikami's discipline shows up again. He's committed. He didn't hedge. He didn't make it half action, half horror. He leaned into vulnerability. And that clarity is why Resident Evil feels intentional. Not messy, not confused, but intentional. It had a point of view. And when it launched, it hit. Hard. And not because zombies were new, but because the feeling was new. You felt small. You felt tense. You felt like survival was a calculation. That hesitation we talked about earlier, that becomes the genre. Not the monsters, the feeling of hesitation. And once Resident Evil succeeds, something shifts. Publishers realize fear can absolutely sell, but much more importantly, fear can be designed. Not just animated, but designed. You started seeing more atmospheric horror games, more system-driven tension, more focus on the pacing. Resident Evil didn't just create a franchise. It created an entire design language, and that language spreads just like the T-virus. But here's the twist. Most creators at this point would say, hey, we nailed it, let's refine it. And that's where Mikami becomes fascinating, because instead of polishing the formula forever, he eventually breaks it. But we're not there just yet. At this moment in 1996, what you're witnessing is the solidification of survival horror. Fujiwara experimented with the mansion. Mikami turned the mansion into a psychological weapon. And from that point on, opening a door in a video game was never the same again. So in 1996, Resident Evil lands. Survival horror is defined, and the formula proves that it works. The fixed cameras, the scarcity, the vulnerability, the deliberate pacing. So by the late 90s and early 2000s, that identity is locked in. Resident Evil 2 expands the story. Resident Evil 3 adds pressure. Code Veronica evolves scale. But the core language always remains the same. Fixed perspective, tank controls, resource management, structured dread. And then something very, very interesting happens. The formula starts aging. Not failing, just aging. The technology is moving forward. Players are becoming more comfortable with 3D space, and camera expectations are changing. And this is where most creators cling to tradition. They double down, they polish, they protect. But Mikami, he detonates it. When Resident Evil 4 enters development, it doesn't arrive fully formed. There were multiple prototypes, different ideas, different tones, different mechanical directions. And one of those early builds eventually splinters off and becomes the hit game Devil May Cry. Let that sink in. An early Resident Evil concept becomes an entirely new franchise. That's how experimental the development phase was. Capcom wasn't just tweaking the mansion formula. They were searching. And now here's where it gets bold. Mikami decides the fixed camera has to go completely. Gone. And in its place, an over-the-shoulder, tight third-person perspective. And that sounds completely normal by today's standards. But in 2005, it was completely revolutionary. Because that camera did something huge. It put you directly behind the character's shoulder. You aim manually. You control precision. You feel physicality. This wasn't press button to auto-aim zombie. This was line up your shot, control your space, commit to your position. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. Mikami didn't remove vulnerability. He just changed its flavor. You see, in Resident Evil 1, vulnerability came from restriction. And in Resident Evil 4, vulnerability comes from pressure. Enemies swarm, they can flank you, they push you. You're more capable, yes, but you're also more exposed. It's kinetic fear, not quiet dread. And that shift reshapes the entire industry. You can literally draw a straight line from Resident Evil 4's camera to Gears of War, Dead Space, and most modern third-person shooters. That shoulder perspective becomes the standard, and it all starts right here with Resident Evil 4. Now, imagine the risk internally. You are the guy who defined survival horror. You could ride that identity for forever. But instead you say, we're going to do something completely different. Fans could have revolted. The critics could have rejected it completely. The genre could have fractured. But instead, Resident Evil 4 becomes one of the most influential action games ever made. And here's what I love about this moment. Mikami doesn't protect his legacy. He evolves it. He refuses to fossilize. And that is completely rare. Creators usually defend what made them famous. Mikami, on the other hand, tears it down and rebuilds it. And that tells you something important about him. He was not obsessed with preserving a formula. He was obsessed with the tension. And tension can look different over time. 90s tension, isolation. Early 2000s tension, chaos control. Same exact philosophy, just different execution. And that right there is growth. Now, here's the part people sometimes gloss over. This shift does change Resident Evil permanently. Some fans argue it becomes more action than horror. And that is a fair debate. But from a design perspective, it's evolution. The market shifted, hardware improved, player expectations matured, and Mikami, he adapted. Not reactively, but intentionally. That's confidence. He didn't stumble into Resident Evil 4. He committed to it. And that commitment is why it works. Because again, it feels cohesive. Even in reinvention, there's discipline. And that's the through line from Fujiwara to Mikami. Structure, intent, commitment, just expressed differently. And after reshaping the franchise, after reshaping third-person design, Mikami makes another move. He leaves Capcom. And that might be the boldest move of all. So Shinji Mikami leaves Capcom. And that's a huge deal. Because most creators who define a franchise, they stay tied to it. Their name becomes inseparable from the brand. They become the Resident Evil guy. Forever. But Mikami didn't cling. He moved. And that tells you something about him. He wasn't trying to be the guardian of just one formula. He was just trying to grow. So after leaving Capcom, he works with Platinum Games and directs the game Vanquish. And if you've played Vanquish, you know that game does not care about slow dread. It is kinetic. It is super fast. It is stylish chaos. Boost slides, bullet time, sci-fi energy. It's the complete opposite of walking cautiously down a dim hallway counting your ammunition. And I love that, because it proves something fundamental. Mikami was never just horror. He was tension. And tension can be quiet, or it can be loud and explosive. Vanquish shows he understood pacing at both extremes. But here's where the lineage circles back. In 2010, Mikami founds Tango Gameworks, a brand new studio, new energy, brand new chapter. And in 2014, Tango releases The Evil Within. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because when The Evil Within was announced, a lot of people said, he's going back to Resident Evil. But that's not what it was. The Evil Within isn't corporate bioterror horror. It's psychological fragmentation. It's distorted reality, shifting environments, unstable perception. It feels less like what if a virus escaped and more like what if your mind is breaking. And that's evolution. It's a creator revisiting fear with more experience, more maturity, less formula. The pacing is uneven on purpose. The imagery is grotesque. The horror is more internal. It's not trying to recreate 1996. It's exploring what fear feels like now. And that's the pattern we've seen from the very beginning. Fujiwara experimented with structural horror. Mikami refined it into atmospheric survival horror. Then he reinvented it into kinetic action horror. Then he left it. Then he returned to horror through psychological surrealism. He never stayed still. And that's what separates a franchise architect from a genre influencer. Mikami didn't just create a blueprint. He demonstrated that blueprints can change. And that right there is incredibly powerful. Because if he had stayed rigid, if he had protected fixed cameras forever, if he had refused to evolve, Resident Evil might have fossilized. But instead, the genre expanded. And here's something I think is important to acknowledge. When you look back at Fujiwara and Mikami together, you see something rare in creative industries. Mentorship that leads to evolution. Fujiwara plants the idea. He experiments with tension as a system, and then he hands it to Mikami. Mikami doesn't just replicate it. He interprets it. He amplifies it. Then eventually, he breaks it. And that right there is healthy creative lineage. Not imitation, but growth. And here's where I want to zoom out for a second. Survival horror wasn't born from a monster design. It wasn't born from gore. It was born from restraint, from vulnerability, from scarcity, from perspective control. And that philosophy starts with Fujiwara experimenting way back in 1989. And it solidifies with Mikami in 96. Then it evolves in 2005. And then it matures in 2014. That right there is a 25-year arc. And here we are, decades later, still feeling it. Every single time we hesitate before opening a door, every time we conserve our ammunition, every time we weigh whether a fight is worth it, that's inheritance, not nostalgia. Inheritance. And that's why this lineage absolutely matters. Because Resident Evil didn't just create a franchise, it created an entire design language. And that language came from a mentor and a student who both understood that fear isn't loud, it's controlled. So when we celebrate Resident Evil's 30th anniversary, when we celebrate Shinji Mikami, how about we also tip our hat to Tokuro Fujiwara? Because without Sweet Home, there's no Mansion framework. And without that framework, there's no Resident Evil. Without Mikami's restraint, there's no survival horror as we know it today. And without his willingness to break his own formula, there's no evolution. That's lineage. That's growth. And that is a damn fine legacy. And it's all worth celebrating. And that's it. That's the lineage. And all these years later, we're still walking slower in digital hallways because of decisions made in the late 80s and the 90s. That right there, that's inheritance. And that's the story. So before I get out of here, as always, shout out to my player 2. You've endured my long-winded fixed camera debates, my dramatic door-opening pauses, and my actually Resident Evil 4 changed the entire industry. Lectures for, well, years now. You're the real MVP. And Ian, my brother, the Natipedia of Resident Evil. If there's ever a puzzle with 3 crests, 2 statues, and a suspicious painting, I'm calling you first. I appreciate you always, brother. And shout out to everyone behind the scenes here at the Nerdcast. Without you, this wouldn't be possible. You know who you are. And to everyone listening right now, seriously, thank you. If you've been rocking with me through the heavier episodes, through the history dives, through the cultural tension stuff, and now you're here for some classic nerd lineage, that means everything to me. This is the stuff that built us. So if this episode made you think differently about Resident Evil, if it made you want to boot up the mansion again, if it made you hesitate before opening a door, then do me a favor. Share the episode. Send it to that one friend who still defends tank controls like they're a personality trait. And then, while you're at it, leave the show a rating. It genuinely helps more than you think. And then follow the show so you can stay up to date every single week when we drop new episodes. And if you're not already in the private Facebook group, then come hang out with us. Because sometimes these conversations don't stop when the mic turns off. They just get better. We've got Mainline Mondays, Checkpoint Thursdays. And the lobby, it's always open. I'll drop the link to the private Facebook group in the show notes, or you can head right over to Facebook and in the search bar, just type Average Joe Nerdcast the lobby and you will find the page. And remember, stay gold, nerd bold. And whatever you do, don't open that door. I'll catch you on the next one.
Game over.